What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to basketball. And more importantly, welcome back to our season preview series, the series where we're going to dive into every single NBA team before the start of the regular season. In this series, we go extremely in-depth. We're going to talk about rotations, what's a team's salary cap situation look like, what's their draft assets look like, their depth chart, their offseason trade ideas, everything you could possibly need to be ready for the start of the regular season. And in this video, we have the Utah Jazz. That's always a fun team to talk about. They're in a very interesting spot compared to other teams, so make sure you guys like, subscribe, and comment. I've responded to every single comment on my YouTube channel up to this point, and I intend to keep on doing so. All right, let's get into it. Alrighty, y'all, as you can see, there is a lot to get to in this video when we're talking about the Utah Jazz, but before we even talk about that, if you guys were curious, this is my season preview spreadsheet. I like to put these spreadsheets together to kind of help articulate and tell the story of whatever I'm talking about in my videos. If you want access to the spreadsheet or any of my spreadsheets, pretty easy. All you have to do is go down in the comments and be like, hey, I'd like access to the spreadsheet. From there, I'll drop you a link to join my Discord. Shoot me a DM on Discord then saying, hey, I was from the YouTube video. Can I get the spreadsheet? I then give it to you there. I actually gave it to like 2 or 3 people yesterday. Always a cool thing for me to be able to do. So if you guys want that, pretty simple process, and it helps out my algorithm a little bit. But let's talk about the Utah Jazz. That's what you guys are here to listen to me talk about today. So the Jazz are now a year or two into this kind of rebuild or retooling that they went through when they lost Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. The Utah Jazz are frequently involved in the playoffs. They're a franchise that have a lot of success. They usually don't stay down for very long, and it's because they've got a culture of being like, we're always trying to win basketball games. This is what we do. We're never just like full-on tanking. That's never their belief. I mean, even when they moved on from Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, I mean, they brought in Lauri Markkanen and turned him into like an all-star caliber player that a lot of us like always anticipated he could have been if given the right opportunity. And they just always find a way to develop players, put people in the right spot. Their organization is very well run, so they don't stay down for very long. And while they haven't been in the playoffs for a couple seasons now, this team's certainly trying to get back into it while also trying to balance, like, okay, how do we still draft some players coming in? Because that's the only way that this team really builds, right? Like, there's no big name free agent that's being like, I'm going to go to Utah and change things around. Like, sorry, Utah Jazz fans, it's not happening. They know they have to build through the draft, but they want to stay competitive because that's the culture that they've set. So it's a complicated thing to balance, and you see that in their record. 31-51. Not a good basketball team last year, but not like downright horrible either, right? Like, this team was very competitive, and honestly last year they started out the season like winning quite a few games or whatever, and then they kind of bottomed out more towards the end of the year as kind of like a mini tank, if you will. They rested a couple people towards the end of the year, and they were like, okay, let's improve the draft position just a little bit, right? But they came out of the gates pretty hot, and they were a team that was always fighting every single night. So that's why we have this team listed as like rebuilding right now. Like, this team never goes into like selling mode. I'd still say they're rebuilding. I wouldn't call this like a growing team. While they have Lauri Markkanen, and that's a great piece and everything, they're still trying to figure out who the rest of the pieces are here. They've got some interesting young guys. They've got a couple vets on the team too that maybe could go to other places. It's hard to tell, but it's a weirdly built roster to start with. There's probably a lot of question marks about like, is this really the best way to balance everything? We don't necessarily know. So I would call this a rebuilding team. They're trying to figure out what pieces are long-term and which ones are short-term. And we all know this is a big draft coming up, right? So what are we going to do with that? Are we going to be able to get a big-time player in that? We don't know. But let's talk about some of the goals that we have for Utah this year. I always talk about these at the beginning of the video so that you can keep them in mind as we're talking about all the other finer details later on. First goal, utilize valuable players. This team has valuable players on the roster. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they need them, right? This team is always trying to win at all times, right? So it's not a surprise that they keep certain players on the team just because they're like, look, we're not just going to trade people to trade people. It's not what we do. But there are some guys on this team that are pretty tradable that a lot of teams would probably like to have. So I think there's some bidding wars you can start for some players on here to try to improve. Like, you don't necessarily need to improve your draft capital a ton on this team because you do have a pretty good draft selection, but maybe you can steal some other young players or something, or maybe you improve the draft assets that you have in some capacity. I just think something should be done to kind of not completely bottom out, but to try to improve your situation this year, because I feel like this next draft is very key for this team. If they can go get like that dude, that first kind of like real franchise player next to like Lauri Markkanen, then we're going in the right direction with something. Then maintain the culture of winning. I think that that's such a valuable thing. You guys hear me talk about culture a lot on this channel, and it's just because I've been in it and I've done it, and I continue to like educate people on it through like my profession and stuff, and what I do now when I go into teams and I talk about this stuff and like how do you win, how do you establish a culture of winning. The Jazz do things the right way for a reason, and they're one of those franchises that's very respected. I always tell people it's the Heat, the Pacers, and the Jazz. Those three teams always try to win. They don't bottom out. Like, there's other good franchises as well, obviously, but those three teams have made it very clear that they're like, no, we don't bottom out. That's not what we do. We're never going to do that. So you want to maintain that, right? Make sure it's very clear to this team that like winning is the expectation at all times. That's going to help you out in the long run. And then get some young guys on the floor. This team has a lot of interesting young players on the team, and we'll talk about all those guys, but we have to maybe move a little bit of what do we want to call it, top heavy like depth for certain positions, so we can get these guys in the court, because we want to see what they got right now, right? Because we are kind of in a bit of a rebuilding state at this point. We probably got to move on from a couple other people, so let's try to get these guys on the court while trying to maintain winning. It's a tough balance, right? A lot of people would probably say it's just easier to completely bottom out and try to build back up. Hard to say. The Jazz are frequently involved in the playoffs, though, so it's hard to argue with like the logic. Or have they ever been true contenders in recent memory? That's probably an argument against it. But regardless, we want to get those guys in the court. We want to see what we can do with all of those guys. But anyway, let's talk about this offseason and everything, because they had an interesting one, especially at the draft, and we'll talk about some of the new faces on the team. Alrighty, so we're here on our off-season tab. Like, who did we gain? Who did we lose this off-season? I always break this down into a couple different categories for those of you that haven't watched the rest of the videos. And if you haven't, go watch some of the old ones. It's the dead point in the NBA season. Like, you might as well go watch some stuff. It's some basketball content for you sweats out there. But the first one we got is drafted players here. You guys understand what that means. Player departures, so players that were on the full-time roster last year that are no longer on it. And then players brought in, so other NBA players that have now been signed or traded for that have been brought onto the team, right? So let's start off with the drafted players, because they had three pretty high draft picks this year, right? One being in the lottery, one being towards the end of the first round, and one being early in the second round, right? So let's start off with Cody Williams, which this is probably one of the best places Cody Williams could have ended up. We watched a lot of film on Cody Williams on this channel, and some of the things that we noticed about him is like kind of a lack of explosiveness, which kind of concerned me a little bit as for a young and raw prospect. But what are some of the good things that we did see out of him? He's got incredible length and vision already. He's already shown that he can handle the rock a little bit, which is cool. He was able to navigate pick and rolls effectively, find open guys, things like that. The shooting is less than desirable right now, but you've got this really lengthy, hopefully good defensive player that can handle the rock a little bit, that can play make a little bit, sees the game really well, hopefully turns into a little bit of a better athlete. Sometimes it takes a little bit for that stuff to develop, and you forget how young these guys actually are, and it does take a little bit to do that. But I just think Cody Williams is going to take some time to figure out if it's really going to be something. He is a very, very raw prospect, and so what better place than Utah to do that, where they do have a better history of actually developing people. They're going to be a little more patient. They're going to put them in good situations to succeed. So that's a good place to end up for him. And they kind of continue that theme of like upside and everything with Isaiah Collier here. At some points last year, a lot of people thought Collier was going to be the first pick in the draft. This stocky, like they measured him at 6'4" originally, and then they found out he's more so like 6'1", 6'2" or something like that, which hurt his draft stock a little bit more. But you saw this incredible athlete that can get to the hoop pretty well, is very willing to pass. We'll call it that. The reason I say it like that is because the turnovers are pretty high. He didn't see the court very well in college, and that was a big red flag for me, because I'm like, okay, you got this point guard that is extremely like athletically gifted, right? We see that, and we understand he's a really cool like archetype of athlete. That's awesome, but he didn't see the game very well. Like, he didn't play the game very smart in college, which is a concern, because I'm like, okay, if you couldn't figure out the college game, I'm not sure how you're going to figure out the NBA game. And, you know, it could always happen. I hope it works out for him, but that brings a concern. And then you combine that with the extremely poor shooting that you saw out of him. It's like, okay, I don't know what I'm getting out of this point guard then. Like, I don't know what skill set I'm supposed to rely on right now. And like year one, I think he's going to get a chance to play. Like, I do think he's going to get that opportunity. He's going to get a chance to grow, and that's the only way to get better, right, is to get on the court and try some things. So we're not going to hold it against him in year one if it's not the greatest thing in the world. It's just going to take time, right? But Isaiah Collier is a big question mark. The upside is certainly present just because of like his athletic ability and like his just physical build, I think is really interesting. But I personally think there's a lot of hurdles to go over with this guy, but I really hope it works out for him. And then we got Kyle Filipowski. A lot of people thought that this guy could be a lottery pick, but fell to the second round. Why is that? I was involved with some of the draft process with him, and you heard all the stories and everything about the weird situation he's in, like off the court and everything. A lot of people said they got a little bit weirded out with him during the interview process and everything, but I'm not gonna lie, when I watched his film, and I don't want to ever drag people through the mud on YouTube or just in general, and I don't think you guys should in the comments either. I don't think it's a good practice. Like, there's just so much more that goes into basketball, but I'm trying to say this in the nicest way possible. He just kind of played a soft style of basketball for his size and stature. Like, he didn't take contact very well. He doesn't seek contact very well. Like, he's not really moving people out of the way to get rebounds and stuff like that. Like, he was never really a great, like, defensive threat or anything. He's not that mobile. So I personally wasn't that high on Filipowski either. But the skill set is interesting, right? Because you do have a 7-foot dude that has a lot of mass to him, that can shoot the three ball pretty effectively and does see the game pretty well. Like, you see that he like understands the game. Most Duke guys do, right? They have to be somewhat smart to play on that team always. So it's interesting in that sense, right? Like, there is some capabilities there, but the downsides of him is what gave me a lot of pause. But at the end of the day, second round pick for a guy like this that does have that kind of upside, and it's just hard to find people at that size and in general nowadays. I don't hate the pick at all. Him coming to Utah is somewhat of a question mark because of the things happening off the court, but we don't need to get into that here. That's just not my business. Let's talk about some of the players they lost. Losing out on Chris Dunn, who has kind of found his way back into the NBA and established himself as just like a nice backup point guard that isn't going to turn the ball over too much and play good defense, which that's kind of what he's always been, but now people have just given up on the potential upside of him. He got traded to the Clippers, got a new contract. Good for him. Talen Horton-Tucker, yeah, it's interesting, right? At one point, the Lakers viewed this guy as like untouchable and that his potential was that high. I never quite understood that. I liked the build of like 6'5", stocky, can handle the rock pretty well, actually has some decent quickness for his first step and everything. I'm like, okay, like, yeah, this is an interesting type of player, but like a lot of the things just haven't quite come around for Horton-Tucker yet. I mean, if you look at it, like the three-point shot hasn't quite found its way yet. You got 10 points out of him, and you got 3.5 assists. Turnovers were maybe a little bit high for how much he had the basketball, but it just hasn't quite manifested in anything. He's still not an efficient basketball player. He hasn't found a clear way to really contribute on offense, so he's just got this weird skill set and build that hasn't turned into anything yet. The Bulls just gave him like a training camp roster or whatever, because of course the Bulls needed more guys that are like basically fucking point guards, but it's whatever. I'm not here to question that. He's probably not going to make the full-time roster either. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up like overseas or something this next season, but he's no longer on the team. Omer Yurtseven, basically just enormous body, right? Like 6'11", like isn't he like 260, 270, something like that? Not a clear skill set that he really like relies on most of the time, but just really, really big body, no longer on the team. He's gone. Kiara Lewis Jr., at one point, the New Orleans Pelicans wanted to prioritize him over Lonzo Ball, and that's what I always remember him for. Hasn't really found his place in the NBA yet. He's really quick. He's really athletic. Yeah, that's about all I got for you. Luka Samanik. I don't know how to say his name. I think it's Samanik. Just bounced around a little bit at this point. Sounds like he's going to fall out of the league at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if someone gave him another chance because he does have an interesting skill set. Definitely sees the game pretty well. Got decent like coordination and everything for his size. Maybe could be an outside shooter at some point, as a lot of these like foreign bigs come in with like a very balanced skill set. That is kind of him, but it just hasn't quite stuck yet. So not surprised to see him kind of falling off the roster here. We have Kenny Lofton Jr., which I know it confuses some people why he's not like on an NBA roster. I like watching him play. I really do. It's not an NBA talent. It's like he's going to dominate G League stuff for forever. It's a completely different game. He doesn't have an NBA style game. I'm sorry, he just doesn't. And then Darius Baisley, who we've seen have like interesting moments where like he's been like a good like 3-and-D player in the NBA, but it just hasn't been consistent enough for him to really stick around. So he's gone now. So a lot of like not that important names. Like, look, these guys are all great in their own remarks and everything, but you're not losing anybody like all that crazy on this team. So that's a good thing. And then who did they bring in? Well, interesting people to say the least. I wouldn't say anybody of extreme like notability by any means, but they brought in some names. Drew Eubanks, who was a backup center for the Suns last year, not a great defensive presence, can get up above the rim at times, gives a great effort on the court. He'll be a good reserve big for them, right? Bringing in another reserve guy here, Svi Mykhailiuk. I thought Svi was going to be a lot better, actually, when he got in the NBA, because I liked his skill set. He's sneaky athletic. He can shoot the rock pretty well. Well, I say that, and then, like, the actual percentages weren't actually that great in recent memory, but, you know, is what it is. But Svi Mykhailiuk is just going to be a nice reserve wing for them. He's played in the NBA for a while at this point, so not the worst thing to have guys like that on the team. And then continuing the trend of just having like reserve players that have been around the NBA for a little bit, none more than Patty Mills, who's just going to be like a Udonis Haslem type for this team. Is he going to get on the court much? Probably not. Good leader to have on the team. Exactly, and that's why the Jazz run things so well, right? They realize the value of having guys like this. Most people aren't giving Patty Mills a contract at this point. They're like, we'll use a roster spot on Patty Mills and like let him just be the veteran on the team that's going to lead all these young guys on the team, right? Like guys to help guide Cody Williams, Collier, and Filipowski. You need on-court dudes to do that aren't coaches. Patty Mills is a walking example of something like that, so good for Utah, man. You should always like use your 15th roster spot on something like that, or if you already have a very veteran team, find a young guy with like a lot of upside for the team to kind of nurture and grow, something like that. But all right, that was the offseason. Kind of interesting, right? Let's go talk about like the rest of the roster and what the depth chart's looking like, everything like that. Alrighty, so y'all know this is my favorite tab in the whole workbook because this was basically the ideal offseason spreadsheet. And I know, you're already looking, there's a lot of green on here. A lot of green, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. But this tab right here is good for a lot of different things, right? We could talk about the current roster and the breakdown of it, like whose salary's coming up, what kind of options do we have going forward. We have depth charts that we can take a look at. We have salary cap situations to take a look at, and draft assets. I always like to start off with draft assets because I think that's a good avenue for when we eventually go in and start talking like trades and things like that. So we'll start off with talking with draft picks and we'll move into the rest of it. So I'll start off by saying some picks not shown do have protections. I always just include stuff that's like actual like maybe like tradable assets and stuff like that. So that's how I like to list things. But holy first round picks. Yeah, no, the Jazz have done a really good job of this. Much like the like Oklahoma City Thunder, I'm going to say like, don't the Rockets have like a lot of picks too or something like that? And like Brooklyn, they're one of the teams in the NBA that's just stockpiling all the first round picks. And a lot of this came from the Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell trades, right? Like they got a ton of first round picks for those guys. So let's start breaking this down, right? Because their own picks like are like protected and stuff like that. So they should have their own pick next year, I believe, as well. But even regarding that, next year they still have a Cavaliers and Timberwolves unprotected first round pick. So they can use those, package themselves, move up in the first round, something like that, right? Great assets to have. They then have their own 2026, 2027 pick. You got unprotected Cavs and Timberwolves picks again. You have a Lakers pick in 2027. 4 first-round picks in 2027. You don't need all those. We can utilize those some other way. We just can, but you've got them all if you need them. You then have more Cavs picks, your own picks, a lot more Cavs, Timberwolves picks, the Rudy Gobert trade, right? You finally have some second-round picks again once you get into like 2029. You got some swap best things, a couple protections on it, but most likely all these picks are going to convey, right? It's crazy the amount of first round pick talent that they have here, and they could acquire more by like moving on from some of these other valuable players that they have. And this is why I say like you just keep trying to win. You keep these valuable players on the team. You keep recycling assets. That's the way to do things. And the Jazz are in a position now to where if they want to strike on someone, they can strike on someone. I don't know who that is. Should they do it right now? Probably not. They need to build some things up from the bottom a little bit more first, but they're in a great position going forward draft asset wise. It just doesn't get much better than that. And then we go into the salary cap situation in itself, and you know what? Looking pretty good there as well. For those of you that aren't aware, there's 4 levels to the NBA salary cap. If you want a deeper explanation to those, go watch like the first video or 2 in this series. That's where I talk about like the Celtics and the Grizzlies. I just go a lot more in depth with them, but here's a quick rundown. So the first one is just the cap line in general, pretty basic. Luxury tax line, as soon as this number would hit 0, you're just going to pay a lot more for your team to exist. And then you have the first and second apron. These are 2 newer things that were brought to the NBA as a way to try to control star players being moved so much. It would have made Utah's job much harder moving like Gobert and Donovan Mitchell if the rules were in place as they were today. But They don't want star players being traded all the time now. It's not good for like NBA like retention numbers and fan base numbers and interest and things like that. And I'm personally a fan of it. So basically, when you cross these aprons, they start to lock down teams, and the only teams that are going to cross this are the really, really good teams. So basically, once you get into these aprons, you just got to stick with the team you have, or you got to start moving people out and getting worse, which I think is good. I think it's good for the NBA. I like it. I'm always down to hear opinions on it though. But as far as the Jazz go, Jazz still have 24 million in cap space to use, and they've got a pretty good roster. Like, it's not great. It's not bad though either. Like, they've got a good amount of assets. This is not an easy team to beat in, like, night in, night out. Like, you've got all-star level player on the team. You've got solid other players on the team that can go get you like 16, 17 points in a night, like promising young point guard and stuff. You got a couple guys coming off the bench and stuff. So all this considered, this team's done a really good job of managing its assets. It's got the ability to just do whatever it wants right now. The Jazz can do whatever they want, and that's awesome, right? And they don't necessarily have to right now. So remaining patient, trying to just win and grow internally and stuff like that, that's going to be good in the long run. Are the Jazz going to win the finals this year? Most likely not. Sorry, Utah Jazz fans, but you should have some comfort knowing you're being like managed extremely well. Take it from a Bulls fan. I wish I could say we were in this type of situation. But anyway, let's move over here and start talking about like the current roster and their situation right here. So the most expensive player on the team right now is actually John Collins, who's not making an egregious amount of money. It's maybe a bit much, but given what starters go for nowadays, like an average starter is probably going for like 20, 21 million. John Collins is a bit above average, so it's not the worst thing in the world. He actually does have a player option at the end of this year, which I'd be surprised if he didn't accept. But I think John Collins, while in an interesting spot, just because of the roster and the shape of the roster in general, he's put in a weird spot, right? You've got a bunch of other bigs around him. He's not having a lot of like creation for him, but overall he was pretty productive last year. Like, he was solid again from threes, getting you like 16 to 18 points on an average night. Like, defensive numbers aren't great, but the defensive numbers just weren't that great for like everybody last season, so I'm not necessarily tripping about that. John Collins is a pretty good basketball player. Do I think that you should maybe move him to explore some of the other like bigs that you have on the team? Yeah, probably. Like, there's not much time left on his contract. Now is probably the time to move him. You're going to get the most value for him. So I don't know. I think John Collins is a great trade piece, and a lot of teams would probably be interested in him. Speaking of other tradable guys, Colin Sexton. Again, on a pretty good contract. Offense has always been there for Colin Sexton. That's always been his thing. Dude can go get buckets. If we go look at Colin Sexton here, 18.5 points a game. That's awesome. 40% from three. Amazing. 4.9 assists, 2.1 turnovers, right? Kind of tough. He's never been able to truly fit into that point guard role because of the playmaking abilities, and the defense has always been bad. It's a very common misconception. A lot of people think Colin Sexton's this lockdown defender. He's statistically always one of the worst defenders in the NBA, and it's not because of effort. The effort's there. He just can't stop anybody. He really can't. He's got always one of the worst defensive ratings in basketball each and every year. It's just who he is, unfortunately. I like to think it can improve because he's got an interesting build, and like sometimes his effort does lead to stops and stuff, but more often than not, his defensive numbers are actually pretty in the toilet. But Colin Sexton, really nice offensive player. I think if someone brought him in as a super six man, I think like the Minnesota Timberwolves or something like that. I don't know how they make that work, but it'd be kind of cool. I think he could be a valuable piece to somebody, right? But if you're keeping him on the team as just a scorer, I respect that as well. Larry Markkinen just got a big contract extension. That's why he's got 5 years left on this. He was obviously the talk of the offseason, and why is that? Because these aprons make it very hard to trade for star players nowadays, right? But Larry Markkinen was a star player making way below average money, only $18 million. But Larry Markkinen has said time and time again, I like being in Utah. Like, I've got no problem with living here. Apparently it reminds him a lot of Finland, where he's from, and he likes the organization because it's run well. He's like, I can just kick it here if y'all want. And he's actually set himself up with how his contract is now, where he can't even be traded this season. So he's going to be with Utah for the foreseeable future. He's going to make a lot more money in the next couple of years. Like, we're talking like $40, $50 million. So cap space situation is going to change a little bit because of that, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. But you've got Lauri Markkanen on the team. He's always going to be a borderline all-star player, can put the ball on the floor, can shoot, decent enough defender. Like, there's not much that he can't do. His build of player is very unique. There's just not a lot of guys that can do what he can do in the NBA. So very, very special talent. I wish the Bulls would have realized it when they had him, but Lauri Markkanen is a great player. I always think he'd be better off like as a power forward or something like that. Playing next to just like Walker Kessler. I think that's another reason to try to move John Collins. I think you'd maximize Markkanen a little bit more then, but nonetheless, interesting guy. Jordan Clarkson on the team, Super Six man, always just out there to get buckets. Never the most efficient person in the world. And actually, I want to look at his shooting chart. So this is Jordan Clarkson's shooting chart. And now let's remember, it's Jordan Clarkson's job to go out there and just shoot the shit out of the basketball, right? That's his job. Go out there, spark plug. That's your job. Super Six man, go get buckets. So he is getting a good amount of attempts from good spots on the three-point line. He's not hitting a great amount of them, and you see a lot of times he is settling for some of these mid-rangers. The floater's looking pretty good in this spot here, not finishing great at the rim at this point. So I feel like his value has diminished for the last couple of years. There's always been rumors about Utah maybe trading him, getting a couple first round picks or something like that. You're probably not getting that anymore, if a first round pick at all at this point for Jordan Clarkson. He's still a valuable player though, and I think now's the time to probably trade a guy like him. Again, it's nice to have vets like this on the team that can go get some buckets, especially when like the young guys you brought in, they're not getting you more than I can't imagine more than like 10 points a game or something like that between like Cody Collier and Filipowski or something like that. So you need guys like this on the team if you want to remain competitive, but somebody would want Jordan Clarkson for $14 million. I just think they would. Taylor Hendricks is up next. A lottery pick from them last year that it was scary. It was scary to say the least because they were like not even wanting him on the roster. They were just putting him in the G League the whole time. You're like, oh geez, like how rough is this guy or whatever, right? But good news. At the end of the season, he got on the court and he was actually pretty solid. He was pretty rough to start the year. He's a rookie. It's totally fine. Like, we don't judge people until, I always say, I want to start seeing growth by the end of your second year. That's when I'll start to like make a couple judgments on you. But Taylor Hendricks showed some things at the end of the year where he could space the floor a little bit. He was hitting his corner shots pretty well. Like for corner threes and stuff like that, that's awesome. If you're going to be a stretch big that can sometimes attack the rim and stuff like that, cool. That's what we need you to do. So he started to figure that out towards the end of the season. Let's hope we can build off that. He obviously has a team option at the end of this year. Probably going to use it. Let's try to figure out how we can get him on the court a little bit more. Because as of right now, there's Markkanen, Kessler, and John Collins in front of him as people that can like play the forward spots. And I know there's been some people saying like, oh, try to play him at the wing a little bit. I don't really like that one quite as much. I feel like he needs to be more of a forward, like a stretch forward more than a wing. So that's where I would try to grow him. But he's an interesting enough player. We talked about Cody Williams already a little bit. Keontae George, another first-round pick they had last year. That was a great surprise to me. Is he out of Baylor? I'm pretty sure he's out of Baylor. He was kind of a combo guard. A lot of people didn't really know what he was going to be coming in, and I never liked combo guards. I'm like, no, I need someone that, like, I know what position they're going to play. I don't want to have to figure that stuff out. Like, I always think it leads more often than not to, like, not having a position. Keontae George chose point guard, and he chose correctly. So if we take a look at, like, Keontae George's numbers as a rookie, 13 points a game, and this is as a point guard in the NBA last year. Started 44 games for them, shot 33 to 34% from three on like 6 attempts a game. That's awesome for a first year. I'll take that 100%. There's a lot of room for growth there. The rest of the field goal percentage like wasn't necessarily all that great. Assists were pretty good overall. You know, it wasn't the greatest team in the world, but you know, the numbers were there and the turnovers were high. It's going to be high for the young point guards, right? That's not a big deal. Let's take a look at the shooting chart. And this is exactly what you expect out of a rookie point guard, right? A guy that he was probably coming around a lot of screens. People were going under him, forcing him to shoot a lot at the top of the key and stuff. Totally understandable, right? He didn't hit a great percentage of them, but I'm okay with it. You took the right shots here. Obviously taking a lot of these little mid-range ones that are scattered all over the place because you're like, I got to get a shot up, got to do something, right? And a lot of these ones that aren't quite in the paint, right? That's a lot of times being like, okay, I got by my first defender for once, and now I don't really want to attack this rim defender or anything like that, so I'm going to try to float it over him. Very much a young guy thing. I think he's on the right path. I think he's going to start to figure it out, start to show some good aggression towards the end of the season. I like Keontae George. I'm curious to see where he can go this year. Talked about Svi Mikhailuk a little bit and Patty Mills. Johnny Juzang got a new contract for them. Most of you probably aren't familiar with this type of player. Didn't play a ton of minutes for them last year, but very reliable three-point shooter. A little bit younger guy. I believe he's like 23 and like a 6'7", like shooting guard, small forward. So yeah, let's bet on him. The Utah Jazz are a good franchise for doing stuff like this, right? Finding guys that have worked hard and shown a little bit on the court. So you get a new contract. Good for him. I don't think it's all like completely guaranteed, but decent guy to have on the roster. We talked about Filipowski a little bit. Walker Kessler. Loved Walker Kessler coming out of college. When the Timberwolves traded the draft pick that was him, I was like, they should have just kept Walker Kessler. I'm like, he was going to be like that type of dude. And after his rookie year, you were like, oh, wow, he kind of had a better season than Gobert overall. Obviously, he's not as good as Gobert right now. And last season, he did kind of take a step back. Started off the year with some injuries and stuff like that. Never really quite found his footing after that, and that's kind of tough. And like I said, he's got a weird roster around him with a lot of other guys that aren't handling the ball and stuff like that. He can't create for himself. He's a rim defender. It's what he does. I still really like the upside of Walker Kessler, and I think it was just kind of a down year this year. He's got a team option. I'd like to see him at the starting center again for them this season. I like him a lot. Drew Eubanks, we talked about a little bit. We talked about Collier a little bit. The last one is Bryce Sensabaugh, who was a rookie last year. Pretty inefficient overall last year, and the defensive numbers were pretty rough, but he's an athletic wing that was able to get on the court a decent amount this year. And look, they don't have like a ton of like promise at the wings right now, so not a bad young guy to have on the team. He'll have a team option again this season. So that's the roster breakdown. It's not very expensive, which we talked about, and that's awesome. Let's go through the depth chart really quick. You'd look at the point guard position. A lot of question marks, right? A lot of question marks. Keontae George, you feel pretty good about him going into his second season. Hopefully we see some growth. Collier, I'm going to assume, is kind of the backup point guard in this team, obviously with Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson being able to play that position if needed, which is valuable for them. And you got Patty Mills as a reserve. You go into the other guard spots, and it's a lot of combo guards here, right? Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, Juzang's more of like the more wing to guard type players. So you feel pretty good about those, but any of these guys could be moved at any point, so that's always something to consider. At the wing position, we're being generous, calling Markkanen more of a wing. I'd call him more of a forward, but that's where they're probably going to have to play him. And then you got Cody Williams with Sensabaugh as your two young guys. You got Mikhailuk that you can throw out there if needed. So some question marks at the wing position, right? Like, you've got some promise maybe waiting in the wings, but we just don't know right now. You go over to the power forward spot. Again, you could throw Lauri Markkanen in here as well, but you got John Collins, who's always going to be solid. Taylor Hendricks, let's hope we can get him on the court a little bit more this year and see what we got with him. Center position, you actually feel pretty good. You got a ton of size and versatility on this team. You got a defensive, like, big-ass center in Walker Kessler. You got Eubanks, who's just going to be quality and have some size. Then Filipowski, who brings more of the stretch element to things, so maybe he works his way into the lineup at points this season. Hard to say for sure, but you got a couple different looks, so you feel actually pretty good about the center position going forward. And I just love the fact that Utah's got 3 white centers. I just think that's so appropriate for this team. But anyway, so that's the depth chart and everything. What I want to do now is I want to explore what we can do with this roster. This is the point in the video where we try to execute a couple different trades or whatever. I just think it's a fun exercise to explore, like, what kind of role this team could have this season in the trade market and stuff. And this team's interesting, because, like, they could buy on something if the right thing comes available, but more so I want to explore how they can kind of sell some of these people. So that's what I'm going to look at right now. So let's move on to Fanspo. Alrighty, so we're back here on Fanspo, and we're going to draw up some trades. I always love using Fanspo. My initial thought is, and these trades are somewhat repetitive that I've got ideas for, but I think there's room for a Colin Sexton on the Orlando Magic. We talked about how the defense is a little bit rough, but we need an actual shot creator on the Orlando Magic and somebody that could play the point guard spot. I think Colin Sexton would be a great addition to this team, and I think there's a very easy trade that you can execute here where you send over a Cole Anthony. We throw in some picks or something like that. I think, like, what kind of ages are we working with here? 24, 25 years old. Colin Sexton's a much more productive player at this point in his career. I'm going to say, like, a protected first-round pick. Is that safe to say? Is that like a decent thing to throw over? Or is this something where we're throwing some second-round picks over more? So you guys tell me what you think as far as, like, picks or something like that. I'm going to go more so like the second-round pick route or something like that. You save a little bit of money in this when you acquire some more draft assets, right? Maybe a more traditional point guard to have on the roster is a more valuable thing for you right now. This trade should work. something like this could be an interesting thing. You save a little bit of money on the deal too, so I don't think this is the worst thing in the world. I think it'd benefit both teams to some extent just to kind of reallocate assets for the Jazz. Magic get the scoring guard that they're really looking for, and I don't know. I think that could be a good one, but let's try and get a little more interesting with this now. I can't help but think that there's a world where a trade exists between these two teams right here, between the Miami Heat and the Utah Jazz. And what am I kind of thinking with that? I'm thinking it starts off with Colin Sexton again. I think it involves John Collins as well, and I think that there's something that involves like Tyler Hero here. Like, let's say they just really get sick of Tyler Hero for whatever reason. I mean, we've heard the things just about like, oh yeah, no, like we need him to actually start getting better. We need him to start improving. This team's under a lot of like salary cap stress right now, and they're not getting enough out of their roster. So is this something where then they take back a Duncan Robinson as well? I have to imagine this just works in itself, right? So is there a world where you'd rather just have like two more stable, productive players in like John Collins and Colin Sexton, and, you know, the Jazz take their shot at like Tyler Hero? Maybe there's something to this. There's probably more to build around with it, but it's an idea nonetheless. So just wanted to try that one out, and I have one more I want to explore. Is there any conceivable way that we can get Jordan Clarkson onto the Timberwolves? Is there any conceivable way? I'm gonna guess not. Yeah, just because of like salary and everything. I'm doing they're a second apron team, so they have to take back like 100% of the value. Like they can't take on any more money. They can't. That's the rules. And so unless they're trading like McDaniels or something, it's just not really happening. So I just wanted to explore something like that. So that's just where my mind goes for those right now. I want to hear your guys' trade ideas in the comments below, but let's go talk about rotations. Alrighty, so we're back here on the rotation screen. I always put a question mark on here because I don't know what their rotation's actually going to be. This is just my concept for it. It's always a good exercise to do. I do this with my coaches and stuff like that, and the rest of my staffs whenever I was in the season. Like, okay, where do we want our guys' like minutes to kind of even out? Let's start thinking about what rotations work together. So this is what we have drawn up for the Jazz. Want Keontae George still getting a good amount of minutes, maybe not quite like 30 minutes a game yet. He's still young, has a way to go. We still want to be like winning basketball games, and at the end of the day, it might just be better to have Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson on the court to do that. So want to maintain that. Colin Sexton very well could be the second leading scorer on the team again. He's getting 30 minutes. Lauri Markkanen's the best player. He's getting the most minutes. Makes a lot of sense, right? John Collins, valuable player. Want him on the court as much as possible as well, if anything, to drive up the value some more. So we like that option. Walker Kessler being the clear best center on this team, getting close to 30 minutes a game. I'm not sure we can handle playing him much more than that, but you know what it is. Jordan Clarkson, super six man, getting starter level minutes. That's what we expect out of him. Let's try and get Taylor Hendricks on the court a little bit more this year, right? I'd like to get to a spot where he's playing a little bit more even off the bench, and we've moved John Collins for maybe like a more true wing on this team or something like that. I think that could be a really interesting thing, but let's get Hendricks on the court, see what we got. Our lottery pick this year, Cody Williams, let's get him on the court, see what we're doing with that. Remember the goals from the beginning of the video. Get young guys on the floor. That's the goal here. Another one, Isaiah Collier. Let's throw him on the court. What do we got in this guy? We had a first-round pick for him and not a clear backup point guard. Hell, let's give him a shot. And then I got Drew Eubanks out there just as like another center option if they really want to. I don't feel the need to get any of these other guys on the court. Maybe Sensabaugh a little bit in his second year, but for where we're at right now, I think it's okay to throw Eubanks out there just for a little bit to have a more true center on the court. But that's what we're looking at for this. Let's go take a look at some of their lineup numbers from last year to see what was working and what wasn't working. All right, so here's the Jazz's lineup numbers. We actually see a couple like pretty positive lineups for them, and actually one here that was pretty good overall with a lot of minutes. And what did this include? It included Chris Dunn, Colin Sexton, Fontecchio, Lauri Markkanen, and John Collins. So interestingly enough, when they went with more of like a stretch, like dynamic type team, they were actually pretty productive in a pretty good amount of time last year. Obviously, Fontecchio was a big addition for the Detroit Pistons last year, so he might just be a really productive NBA player to have on courts in general. But you had Colin Sexton and Markkanen getting buckets with John Collins and Dunn supporting it. How can we recreate this lineup this year? Maybe Collier falls into the role of Dunn in some way, but where do we find the wing to replace Fontecchio? That's where we're not so sure about. Like I said, when we looked at the roster breakdown, the depth chart, we don't really see a wing that we can really trust on this team, so that's going to be a big question. Maybe Ju Zhang develops into something, and that could be kind of interesting in some capacity. I've got him more towards the bottom as of right now. Honestly, it should probably be more so in this order if we want to get exact about it. That's how I'd probably view it. But regardless, that's kind of our viewpoint of it at this current state. Looking at some of the more negative roster things that we saw last year, we saw like Keontae George with Clarkson, with Oche, who's not on the team anymore, John Collins, Markkanen again. So not a lot with like Walker Kessler. The best lineup that we had did involve Walker Kessler. Doesn't look like any of them otherwise. No, Walker Kessler's pretty actually apparent in like a lot of their better rotations, so that probably tells you something in itself that he should be more involved. We'll look into that more when we look at the 3-man data. But some of these ones, like this one involved Walker Kessler with Kelly Olynyk. See, like these lineups, just like they had a lot of these last year where it was just like, okay, like what are we kind of throwing out here right now? This doesn't really work. Again, we see Agbaji out there, doesn't really look that great. So I don't know. I'm not too worried about some of these like more poor combinations, just because like a lot of these guys aren't here anymore, and hopefully we don't have these poor combinations. Let's go take a look at the 3-man rotations though, because what do we got here? The most positive 3-man rotation was Chris Dunn with Fontecchio and Markkanen. That's unfortunate. Chris Dunn and Fontecchio again with Colin Sexton, Fontecchio again, and then Chris Dunn again. Those are apparently two pretty valuable players to this team, so it's unfortunate that they're no longer there. How are you going to replicate it? Chris Dunn's available again, so already in your top 5 like 3-man combos last year, you don't have at least one of the people in it for each of them. So that's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate. So then the next best one you have is Markkanen, Keontae, and Jordan Clarkson. And it's not the greatest sample size in the world, but it's something. What was like some of the worst ones we saw last year? Colin Sexton with Keontae George and Taylor Hendricks. Yeah, Taylor Hendricks just had a rough season last year more so. So not tripping about that, but I think it's going to be hard for this team to string together some productive lineups just because you don't have that wing in Fontecchio that was so valuable to them and that clear other point guard in Chris Dunn that could kind of run the show for things. I think this team's going to struggle a bit more in that department. But speaking of that, let's go to predictions. Alrighty, y'all. Here we are on the predictions tab. Let's do a little recap of the West because that's who we're talking about with the Jazz today. We got the Thunder and Mavericks on top, Kings in the middle of the pack. We've already got 3 play-in teams listed here for the Grizzlies, Lakers, and the Spurs. Warriors not even close to the play-in we have this year, and we have the Trailblazers at the bottom. Drum roll, please. I knock on my desk every single time. It's a really stupid thing that I do, but we've got the Utah Jazz just before the Trailblazers right here at the bottom. I think it's going to be tough for this team this year, y'all. It's what I was starting to get into there at the end. I think it's going to be tough for them to find really productive rotations given this roster. They're really missing some stuff at the wing. They've got young guards on the team that they're just going to make mistakes. They just are. They've got a weird forward combination that they're kind of trying to work out right now, but that doesn't mean that we should like be tripping about the Jazz, right? The Jazz are still in a pretty good spot where they're growing. They've got a lot of assets to work with. I don't think Jazz fans are probably going to be upset if they finish towards the bottom this year and they get like a top 4 or 5 pick, something like that, right? Because they've got the assets to move up even higher. Nobody's giving up the first pick in this year's draft, but you might be able to move from like a 2 to a 5 or something like that, right? That's probably a negotiable thing. So maybe you can go get your franchise player in this draft, and that's probably what you have to root for this year, and then just root for some internal development, right? Because you do have some interesting players on this team that we want to see work out, but this is where I leave it to you guys. I want to hear what you guys think now. What do you think of the Jazz and their current situation? I think it's an interesting one. I'd be happy if I was a Jazz fan right now. I wouldn't be worried at all. But hey, leave me those comments below. Always be cool in the comment section, right? Make sure you learn from people, listen to people. Don't just be a jerk to be a jerk. Otherwise, I hide you, and I'm not going to let normal internet things just run wild in my comment section. But y'all been good about it so far, so thank you. But anyways, I got you guys 5 times a week for this stuff, 7 a.m. Central Time every time, so you can have your coffee and listen to me talk basketball. But hey, thanks so much, and we'll talk to y'all later.